Camels with Hammers show. I am Dan Finca, host of the Camels with Hammers show, and I'm here with my best friend from college, Bede Hazlett, who is a Benedictine monk. He was instrumental when he was in a period of doubt while we were college students together, a period of religious doubt inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche, who's inspired me to go read Nietzsche. Bede is openly gay and yet celibate as a monk, and he is we're discussing the morality of homosexuality and the church's role in defining homosexuality for many people, and how the Catholic Church understands homosexuality. And what John is arguing, I call him John because that was his name before he became a monk, and he says I'm allowed to call him that. He says that he's arguing that the church is always evolving, that it has room for a progressive revelation. Not, I'm saying that's progressive, that's a loaded word, but progressively understanding God and having moral change. And I'm arguing that the church has been so far behind historically that there's no evidence that's being especially guided by God. And John is starting to concede that the church is like other human institutions in coming to learn. And what I'm saying is that unless there are special indicators that God is especially guiding it towards truth and especially guiding it towards morality, such that we find in the church, insights into truth and morality that are ahead of the curve instead of constantly seemingly behind the curve as it looks, especially in our day in which the church is so responsible for so many ruined lives of gay people, including so many suicides, traceable to Christian teaching and Christian attitudes and Christian institutions. I'm saying these are signs that the church is not even a particularly morally good institution, let alone one especially guided by a morally divine being, a morally perfect being who loves humanity. It seems like it's not even passing the test of a minimally good institution for guiding morality, but in fact an authoritarian, arrogant one that can't even admit its mistakes, let alone be an engine of progress. And so I take that as evidence that the church is false, not guided by a divinely morally perfect, omnipotent being. And I'm asking John to explain why he thinks that it is.
Well, I mentioned a few minutes ago before we were cut off what you might think of as the role of the saints in the life of the church, that there are these examples of people who are sort of morally ahead of the curve, who have insights that are ahead of their time and who live by them. That's important, it seems to me, but it's also important to recognize that the church, as I understand it, doesn't pretend to stand on its moral credentials. And to me, part of what's most compelling about it is not so much the way it behaves as an institution, but the thing that lies at the heart of the tradition, just this understanding of God as human in Jesus Christ. God as present in the created world as a creature, and as having gathered up natural world that we live in into God's own life. The whole sacramental understanding of how the universe can be, if not transparent to God, at least translucent, and how one's relationship with God unfolds in terms of human community and also in terms of our relationship with very tangible material things. The fact that that lies at the heart of the Catholic tradition and is a notion or a set of notions so alien to both of the traditions from which it emerged, the Hebrew one and the classical one, is compelling to me. And I think morally it's important because it gives the Church a set of resources for thinking about what it means to be human and how to live as a human being, that are implicit in the Gospels and implicit in the foundational layer of Catholic tradition, but that have never been fully appropriated or realized. That's something that a French theologian mentions, and I don't think I'll mention his name because I don't know if I'm representing his views correctly, but there's just this notion that at the heart of the Catholic tradition, Christologically, in a Trinitarian sense, and sacramentally, there's an immense cargo of ethical implications and anthropological implications that the Church has, in one sense, only begun to unload or unpack and articulate. So that, I mean, I guess I don't see the development of the Church in terms of the institution's moral goodness as much as I see it in terms of the gradual willingness to overcome certain cultural barriers, including barriers of ecclesial culture, and to take hold of things that have always been there at the heart of the tradition, some of which have just been so challenging that the Church itself has begun to behave like an established institution and has not been quite willing to appropriate those insights. Because this is a tension that goes all the way back in Christianity, that Jesus Christ spawned this institution, or even set of now fractured institutions, and over the centuries they do come to behave like ordinary human institutions, including corruption and paternalism and so forth. And yet there's a great deal that Jesus Christ himself said, or is recorded as saying in the Gospels, taught, and represents, that can't easily be accommodated to the requirements of maintaining that kind of institution. And to me, the way in which those two things have worked themselves out in the life of the Church over the centuries is fascinating and compelling.
But how is it compelling of truth? How is it compelling of special moral guidance? It's an interesting story if you're trying to rationalize the whole human progress as guided in some way towards the good. And if you want to read that dialectic as having a divine hand behind it, and if you were trying to rationalize from that assumption, or if you took that as dogmatically true, but why in the world should anyone looking from the outside see it as anything but maybe an interesting myth about humanity having a divine character in God and Jesus, or something like that, or the divine having a human character? It's an interesting myth about human nature, but where there would be a notion of there being, this is really being guided by a supernaturally omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. Why would such a being, again, have its own institution be such a haphazard mess and not be the beacon on the hill, not really be, that specially, like, unavoidably, wow, these are the people who are divinely inspired? I would almost believe, personally, if Plato was said to be divinely inspired, I could almost believe it. Not because Plato's exactly right, he's quite wrong on a lot of things, but I could still see more resources of moral genius there, more resources of had his insights been, really fully appropriated, at least some of them, I could really see something there. But even then, there's still fallibility of the human. So the question is, like, it seems like there's no evidential reason or any preponderance of rational reason to think that this is the most likely candidate to be the vehicle of what you're claiming is a perfectly morally good God's beliefs. Like recently on your Facebook page, you talked about having internalized in your own psychology, you deal with these feelings that this God is like the bigots, the worst of the bigots who you have to deal with, and hates you the way that you feel like they do. The worst homophobic bigots. And it is the case that the people representing your institution are those people. They are the ones who have demonized you for being gay. And in that context, it, the leap to assume that this God is really there and on your side, it just seems so out of whack with what's palpably observable.
I'm not sure it's fair to say that that the Catholic hierarchy is among the foremost bigoted demonizers of queerness. It's true that there are some fairly unnuanced statements from time to time, but I personally have not encountered outright.
But the attempt to shift blame for authoritarian cover-ups of child rape onto gays is just appalling.
That too is something that's been...
And the authoritarian nature of the institution...
That too is something that's been advocated by a fairly small but vocal minority. Among the Church's hundreds of bishops, I don't think very many have taken that kind of attitude. And in my own experience, the reverse is what tends, within the life of the Church, to be most often articulated, that there is no group definable by orientation that's to blame for the sexual child abuse crisis, but that there are aspects of the Church's culture itself that are part of the problem. Those other voices are very strident and tend to be focused on in the media, but they're not really the majority voices when you think of the Church as a whole. But that wasn't your central question. The central question was more about could you express it again, just sort of briefly to remind me? So I got sidetracked.
Like on what rational basis to say that it's a good belief, if not even a true belief, but let alone even a good one, to say that there's a morally perfect being behind this institution when it is so not special, let alone a city on a hill.
Well, I wouldn't want to say that being is behind the institution exclusively. What I believe is that being is behind the whole universe. And that, too, requires dealing with the fact that the universe itself seems to be a fairly messy, morally ambiguous reality. So I think any belief in God is going to require that you deal with this issue on one level or another, whether institutionally or cosmically. I think it's one of the problems of faith in God. And I tend to deal with it on both levels, cosmically and ecclesially, in a different way now than from the way I would have, say, when we were undergraduates. At that time, as you mentioned yourself, I tended to be very propositionally oriented, very much oriented around trying to distill some propositional statements of truths and hash out whether they're, in a sort of crystalline sense, true or not. I aspired, I think, to a very unpoetic, univocal way of using human language. And in some ways, a basically context-less way of using language. Since then, I've come to think in a different way about all those things. I've come to appreciate, for one thing, that language by its nature and at its roots is poetic. So that everything one's going to say, no matter how much you try to express it in a crystalline, univocal way, is going to have lots of other things that it says at the same time. And I don't want to say that leads me to think in more vague terms about truth claims, but it does lead me to think in a different way about what it means to say something that's true. And it certainly leads me to think in a very different way about myth, for example. A much richer way, seeing myth as potentially communicative of very deep truths, but not in that crystalline, propositional sort of way that used to be so important to me. And I've also come to think in a lot different terms, in terms of about how language and community interrelate, and how aspirations to truth and claims to have access to some truth or some wisdom function in community terms. I guess my goal in the past was to get access to a set of propositions that I could strip out of whatever community context they might have originated in, and work out as true or false in a sort of vacuum. That I've come to see as a self-defeating project, and I've come to see this whole way of dialoguing toward the truth in terms of living within and appropriating a tradition of one kind or another in a community of one kind or another. And that, I know that will all sound very vague and unsatisfactory, but that's how I've come to think about this. And to give a lot more credit to what one of your blog readers has called, I think, deep human intuitions about things. That was one of my major issues as an undergraduate. I have these intuitions about, say, logic, but I have no way of establishing them other than by deploying the very resources that are in question, logically. That kind of circularity used to be very, very bothersome to me, very disturbing. Now it doesn't bother me. I see it as just the way human thought, human language works in human community, and if we're going to have any access to truth or wisdom, that's how it's going to be.
But there are ways to check.
Yeah.
Not everything is a self-contained system. You know,
No,
scientific
no.
methods of objectivity, logical canons,
Right.
testing logical consistency. And so
But that's,
one of those tests is if you have, if you do have certain beliefs about what's psychologically and morally good, and then you have a claim that somebody else is making that you concede is destructive or impediment to people's real lives. As the church is taking centuries, there are people who are right now dying. There are people right now being denied their rights to and their ethical at homeness in the world as gay people. When you see a church standing athwart of that, like there's a contradiction morally there that no amount of poetization or talking about internal coherent systems and communities can deal with. This community harms people.
yeah, but every human community harms people one way or another.
Right, but none of those claim that they're specially guided by God. None
Right.
of them put the lever onto their authority that says, "Don't question us, defer to the church, take things as dogma." None of them, or when they do these things, there's authoritarianism that's so antithetical to people's healthiness. And that's what, so all human institutions are corrupt, but not all of them have built-in mechanisms for bullying people into submission who dissent.
But I think that's an oversimplification of how Catholicism works. I realize that that's how it would appear, you could say from the outside, or on the basis of an acquaintance with the Church derived from the news. But experientially, at least in my own experience, that's not how Catholicism functions. There is an authoritarian dimension. There's also a populist dimension. There is a top-down dimension. There's also a bottom-up dimension. And although what one hears about most is the top-down kind of pronouncements, the life of the church really happens most at much lower levels, the level of parish life, of monastic life in a particular community, for example. And the way in which those things sort of function dialectically is a lot richer than just this draconian, monolithic sort of vision that I could see one having from the outside, and even in some ways from the inside. But I realize that doesn't address your deeper question there. And I'm not sure how to go about addressing it.
Because don't you see where there's a tension where if you are on the parish level and say your son comes out to you as gay, you feel a pressure that I have to differ from the Pope if I accept and if I go to his wedding and I'm happy for him, and I accept his children, and I accept, you know, that this relationship is a good thing, then there's this constant tension with the person who's supposed to be the vicar of Christ. And like, I mean, yeah, that's happening in a dialectical way, but I don't see how setting up the institution so this person feels like he's torn between the vicar of Christ and his son is the ideal arrangement or a healthy community.
But I just don't think in terms of ideal arrangements of that kind anymore. I think of a healthy community in more developmental terms, and thinking of it in those terms requires that there are going to be some tensions that you just have to inhabit. If there weren't, there would be no dynamism, there would be no possibility for deepening or developing. And it's true that's difficult. I know that full well from my own experience. But I don't think it needs to be fruitless. That does leave unaddressed this deeper question of, well, what about people whose experience in the Catholic Church, as far as sexuality goes, has been so toxic as to drive them to suicide, for example? I don't know how to address that, because I would see one's experience in the Church as in continuity with one's experience in the human community as a whole. And that has been a part of one's experience in the human community as a whole, too, until quite recently. And I think in practice, the way people in this situation are actually dealt with pastorally tends to be much more sensitive than you might imagine. It does involve the tension of recognizing, well, say trying to get married as a pair of guys or a pair of women certainly is in contradiction to the Church's current teaching about sexuality. The Church would not say you're evil because of that. The Church would say that you're practicing a disordered sexuality. But if you have the courage to recognize that that is a tension within a developing institution, I think it can be fruitfully lived. And I think that in actual pastoral practice, it's usually dealt with fairly sensitively. This will vary culturally,
though. But no matter how sensitively you're dealing, the fundamental choice is only celibacy or apostasy or sin. I mean,
No.
you know, that no matter how sensitively you put that choice to somebody, you know,
but that's
and
not
yes,
the fundamental choice. I mean, there's also this possibility of conscientious dissent.
But that can't be. That's not being acknowledged by the Vatican.
Of course not, because part of the Vatican's job is to discourage that.
Right, but you see the structure of the so you say that, you know, you need a dynamic institution. That's fantastic. That's why we have democratic institutions. That's why we have academic institutions that are dialectical. But the problem is the way that those other institutions work to create dynamism is by not having any one person set up as an authoritarian vicar of Christ. You don't have in other institutions the authority to stop someone from having the ability to teach within the institution just because they dissent from the vicar of Christ himself. So it's that authoritarian structure which is so antithetical to this dialectical process, which does put people out on a limb where if they're to be conscientious dissenters, they're dissenting from someone who has a reputation for infallibility. Might be only when he wants to sit on the throne in a certain case and speak infallibly, but the dogma, you know, but the ethos is out there that the guy has the final word, you know, and that ethos is a structural impediment to progress. And even if the progress happens anyway, and even if bold and daring and brave conscientious dissenters are out there anyway, you have a system in which to think the new and brave and morally advancing thought is to be threatened with an implicit threat of excommunication, an implicit threat of sin, an implicit threat that God is against you. And it's getting to the point where the Church would rather shut down its own adoption agencies than even allow non-Catholics to adopt. I mean, it's coming down so strongly against gays that to say that it makes any sense to say this is the institution guided by God, a morally good God who morally loves you, and if you disagree with it on homosexuality, you can still dissent. Yeah, maybe you can, but it's not at all an institution which sets that up to be something that people of normal moral fiber and intestinal fortitude can deal with. And a lot of them are suffering in contradiction, and a lot of them are going celibate, a lot of them are killing themselves and suffering in ways that are so counterproductive and so traceable to the authoritarian structure of the institution.
I'm not sure that that's true, though. And I'm not sure that the way the church is structured is as antithetical to development as you're arguing.
In the popular mind, is it?
In the popular mind, certainly. But in the way it actually
comes from.
What?
But where does that come from? How does the popular mind get so distorted on its own church's dynamism when that popular mind is catechized and the people are forced, as children, they're brought to the church, they have to go through this, and yet
so
they still come out with the
mind.
misconception. What?
You're talking about the Catholic popular mind, then?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you meant just in the mind of our culture at large. I think in the Catholic popular mind, that's not as big of a misconception, although certainly it's there to be found, in part because catechesis is not always well done. But the reality is a lot more nuanced. I mean, there's a lot of breathing room theologically. It's true that theologians are occasionally asked not to write anymore, but it takes some doing to get to that point. It's very, very rare, even unheard of, for a theologian to be excommunicated for saying something disagreeable. But that whole tension is part of how this works out. I mean, theologians can advocate increasingly radical ideas. At a certain point, they're checked by the intrinsically kind of conservative and stabilizing papacy. And over the course of time, those ideas kind of resurface and get reworked and discussed, and some of them will probably gradually be appropriated. I think that whole process is actually very fruitful in terms of trying to maintain both a pattern of development and a stability and unity as a kind of community, a huge community. And I think the current Holy Father is a good example of this. As a theologian, he was not unprogressive. He himself was in some ways on the theological vanguard in the 60s, understanding his role in terms of kind of advancing the tradition, proposing new ideas. When he began to take on hierarchical responsibilities, consummately now as Pope, his role kind of shifted. I don't think his most deeply personal intellectual commitments have changed very much, but I think the context in which those play out in terms of his role have changed a great deal. You're right, the whole sense of how this works is not very well understood, even among Catholics. And yet that is how it works and is working. So I'm not sure what more to say.